I think true software engineers understand the danger of vibe coding because like they get like what's going on, but it opens the door to people who have no idea how to code. And it truly brings this capability where I think what I always like to think is people who are now managers in engineering, VP of engineers, CTOs, product managers who just want to build the things that they want. Now vibe coding is giving them this ability to create very real applications and deep prototypes and mock-ups without actually having to understand the code itself.
If you have been wondering about coding assistant AIs and how they're shaping, at least since the past couple of years of AI becoming this massive thing that's integrated into all our organizations, this is the episode with Guy Podjarny, who is a returning guest, who is the founder of a company called Tessl. And in this conversation, Caleb and I spoke to Guy about how much has AI-assisted coding changed. And we spoke about the 3 chapters as it has evolved from being a coding assistant to where it is today. Whether we can still have AI agent-driven code. What is vibe coding? Because finally we have someone who's been deep in this space to at least talk about what is vibe coding, unlike me trying to make it up as I go, because isn't that the vibe? No pun intended. But overall, this is a great conversation for people who are trying to understand that world of how much coding has changed and the workflow behind it and why it would not make any sense if you just care too much about the code you're producing. Instead, it's more about the business requirement and the testing you do behind it. All that and a lot more in this episode of AI Cybersecurity Podcast. If you know someone who is working in this space in your organization or probably a colleague, definitely share this episode with them. And in case you are here for the second or third time and have been enjoying the episodes on AI Cybersecurity Podcast, definitely give us a follow. If you are listening to this on Apple or Spotify, or if you are watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn, definitely give us a follow, subscribe there as well. It only takes a few seconds for you, but we really appreciate it because it lets us know that you are enjoying the episodes and you want us to produce more of it as well. Thank you for the support. And now enjoy the episode with Guy Podjarny. I'll talk to you soon. Peace. Welcome to another episode of AI Cybersecurity Podcast. We have Guy Podjarny. Thank you for coming back again to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I guess I didn't embarrass myself too much last time. Or maybe I did and it was entertaining. We'll find out.
We loved you so much. We wanted to come bring you back again. But for people who may not have heard of you before, could you just give a 30-second version of a little bit about yourself, your background, and all of that?
Sure. So probably my kind of biggest claim to fame is having founded Snyk nearly a decade ago now, which is a software security company, a developer security company, kind of built to really integrate security solutions into the day-to-day of developers, and did that by really building a dev tooling company that tackles security and kind of building the company and the products of that process. Snyk did well. It's now north of 1,000 person and north of 300 million ARR. So it's like a good established, I think, leader in the developer security space. And I accepted at some point that I'm an addict and that I want to do it again. And at the beginning of last year, I left Snyk to found a new company called Tessl, focusing on trying to kind of reimagine software development for the era of AI. Prior to that, I did a few things. Most notable to this podcast is I competed with Caleb a little bit as a developer and product manager on AppScan when he competed with WebInspect at the time. I will paraphrase history and say Caleb last time accepted that we won that race on it. And then
wait a minute. I'm pretty clear we won that. I think we had a resounding beating that you guys lost.
Yeah, I think it was a pretty good journey. It was not successful at getting into developers, but I think both companies sold to some enterprise behemoth instead of IBM and HP and are not dead yet because AppSec, like companies never die. And then I founded a DevOps company called Blaze, sold it to Akamai. I was a CTO there for a bunch of years. So yeah, probably longer than you expected, but I'm dev tools, got into DevOps, and then so security DevOps, security dev, mixing those worlds.
And now
firmly Gen AI, the fascinating and painful world that it is.
So the funny thing is, as a kind of refresher of what we had spoken about last time, I was listening to our episode from last year, and the part which was interesting was we spoke about Stack Overflow on steroids as how AI felt. And since then, vibe coding has become a thing. And I'm like, maybe that's what we were predicting. We just didn't know the vibe coding would become a word. But maybe set some context. I guess maybe we're at that stage where a lot of people would already know what AI-assisted code is. But maybe if you can set the context for how you define it, and maybe you can use that as a starting point to build on what vibe coding is and if it's a reality.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe chart a little bit of a journey. I've actually just spoken about this at the AI Native DevCon that we just hosted for a second time. We've been investing in the community. And I think using AI for software development or AI-assisted software development probably has 3 chapters so far in its story. The first one is really these coding assistants, starting from code completion, first incarnation of just better and better kind of completion snippets for you to do. Originally, Copilot had the zeitgeist, and now Cursor now is at the helm. But really today there are dozens and dozens of coding assistants that just help you write code faster. That happened alongside the world's discovery of chat interface, not just for coding. And as we learned what to do with ChatGPT, one of the primary uses was to have it create coding snippets for us. A little bit of a search for a Quora and Stack Overflow for us, a little bit of mix them in. And so we'd ask for whatever, create me a Python function that charges a transaction using the Stripe API. And it would know what the Stripe API is and what is charging a transaction and what is Python.
Fix this error.
Yeah. And then what happened was you didn't know, you were like, okay, you copy pasted that thing in, it got an error. So I don't know, I didn't write any of this code. I don't understand this API. So you paste the error back in to ChatGPT. And so that brought that chat interface into Coding Assistant. And those kind of pillars remain here. So now we have kind of code completion and chat in the IDE. And those have grown more and more to go. Cursor did like a multi-line and multi-file edit. So it predicts if I'm going to change this line of code, you hit tab, you go to another line of code. And then in the chat, you can give a command and it might propose changes across seven files. And so those kind of the evolutions of more, and probably for security people who appreciate that the more changes it makes for you, they're just glossing over as you approve, the more trust you're putting into the system because you're trusting it to make you grow dependent on it knowing where is that next tab, where is that next file. So anyways, that's chapter one that continues to evolve. Maybe swim lane one, right? As it grows, still the dominant use, but at this point, like well established, people are like shadow IT using it, whether you like it or not in the policy. There are enterprise versions of it for local models and all that, and very much dominant. And that led to chapter two, maybe, which is this vibe coding. I don't know if have you covered vibe coding at all in this?
No, we were hoping you'll cover that for us.
Yeah, we're waiting for you.
Yeah. Vibe coding, it was coined by Andrej Karpathy, which is one of sort of the most notable kind of thought leaders in the world of AI. He had this sort of tweet where he pointed out that he's gotten into this habit using Cursor and Composer, where it just makes an ask, gets a bunch of changes, but it doesn't actually review them. It just doesn't look at the diffs. It just says, okay. And then it does that a little bit. And at this point, he doesn't understand the code. So if he was to review the code, it's like he doesn't even know it. That's fine. And even sometimes hits a dead end. But he says that's fine because it's just like for a throwaway weekend project, that's not a problem. And kind of this term got embraced. This is the coding version of it. And so this is people that are coders that are in an IDE, but they're building applications with a bit more full delegation, if you will, to the AI. Shouldn't be used in the enterprise, is used in the enterprise. Yeah.
In fact, one thing I was going to interject is that I feel like the transition from this IntelliSense smart Stack Overflow code and or edit specific functions, it went from this, hey, help me write something, then help me write a function, then help me write a class. And then it started going into this way more automated capability of being able to create files on its own, be able to run and compile the actual program itself, and then determine the errors via the console, and then recursively do this loop where it would help fix itself, generate more code, run it, compile, fix itself, generate more code. And I think that's where it really entered into this capability of truly autonomously just coding things. And it gave this sort of open door to, I think where vibe coding has really become hot is, I think true software engineers understand the danger of vibe coding because like they get what's going on, but it opens the door to people who have no idea how to code. And it truly brings this capability where I think what I always like to think is people who are now managers in engineering, VP of engineers, CTOs, product managers who just want to build the things that they want. Now vibe coding is giving them this ability to create very real applications and deep prototypes and mock-ups without actually having to understand the code itself. And that's a pretty incredible transition over what the past year that just this all happened.
I think so. And I guess that was precisely the next chapter I got to, which is I think up until now, we've been describing like a developer in the IDE developing code and getting more and more assistance from
Oh, I jumped ahead. Sorry, Guy.
No, it's all good. It's precisely where I was going. And I think that kind of, I guess I refer to these as prompt-centric vibe coding. I was struggling a little bit with the term because like the cursor side, vibe coding was just accept all and don't review it. Cursor actually created a YOLO mode, which they've sadly renamed auto run mode. I like the term YOLO better. That actually does decide automatically, like just accepts all by default. Claude Code has a similar one.
And I think Klein was the first. I would say Klein was the first to do this.
That's fair. You're right. It doesn't have I know it has it. I don't know precisely when. But I think these tools have a tiny bit of agentic of that verification. They don't really do much when they do the YOLO. But on the other side, you have indeed these, what I think is prompt-centric vibe coding, in which you can see the code, but by default, you don't even see it. So there's no guilty moment in which you accept the changes, which you didn't do. Like the idea is that it's still attended, but you're supposed to review the product, not review the code. And the code is, you can fall back to it if you're a person that can understand the code.
It feels more like managing an engineer than being an engineer.
Yeah. And they indeed opened up this sort of door to like many more people to create applications. And as we should get into a little bit, with no supervision, no life cycle management, no notion of maintenance, no security. Who's heard of that? Like none of those. And I think of these as like, it's really optimal for disposable apps, for things that are a prototype. You just want to make a point, for a quiz game you're going to show to your friends, for an app you built for a workshop, for something you're going to be the sole user of and you'll run in your network or something like that. And so for those environments, they're actually super fun. We've been using them. Like I've been toying with them. I went on a road trip with a family on it, and I got all the songs we heard in the car out of Spotify, down the data. Ironically, Spotify doesn't have an upload, create a playlist from that data feature on it. So I created a vibe coding app and created that, right? Or we created things for workshops at Tessl that did that. So they're super, super powerful. I do want to maybe cap that to say like chapter 3 where we're in today it's a bit hard to really differentiate it, but you'd say agentic development that is meant to be enterprise ready. And so like alongside, like if that was like second swim lane that started after coding assistance, swim lane 3 is the sort of agentic development that's broad based. And it's like Devin is the prototype, right? A prototypical sort of app that people talk about, but there are a whole bunch of them. All Hands is open source, for instance. And what they try to do is they try to be much more sort of broad sweeping. Like you can give them an ask, they'll go Google and search the web to extend the requirements. They will deploy, they will iterate, they'll expand. And the vibe coding apps like Lovable and Bolt and Base44 and others, they work within more of a confined kind of a garden. They use Supabase and Netlify, and like they build on a very specific stack. And they try to create an application within those confines. They can't create, for instance, a mobile app. But the agentic development is a bit more of a sheer AI labor that's less specialized than you can harness. And as you go through those chains, you get less and less assurances of what it is, that it's easier and easier to create, and you might say riskier and riskier to create as you walk down that time.
I was going to say, in terms of how, I don't know if this is the 4th chapter, but what I've also been talking to a lot of people around, like the Figma guys had a conference recently called Config, where they released, because they were traditionally hey, I make a workflow for, this is what my app should look like, and I pass it over to a development team that goes and develops it, comes back, and now we have a prototype for an image. I think as of recently, they've opened the feature where the product manager or whoever is the UX person just does the workflow and it automatically creates the app in the background. Are we also saying and I don't know if you guys are saying this, I'm just curious, there's also a whole pool of third parties that have started coding on your behalf. Canva does this as well. Figma does this as well, where they write the code for you, they host the website for you, they host the application for you as well. You can, I think at this point in time, you can't attach it to your company domain. It would still
Vercel, you can do that. Yeah.
Or you can do that as well. So to your point, Guy, what you were saying earlier as well, would that be like the 4th chapter where, you know how no code became popular when people said, hey, no code is going to take over? Where is the difference between a no code, which I look at all these Figma and Canva and all of that, it's like almost like a no code thing. I don't have to know what I'm coding. I just need to know what I'm trying to do. Yeah. And it does the code and makes the prototype for me. Where is the difference between a vibe coding and no coding kind of chapter? Is there one, or is this like completely different to no coding?
Everybody thinks their sort of part of the SDLC is extra special in that sort of journey. And depending on wherever you are, there are tools now for sort of Gen AI to produce a version of that. And so you use these vibe coding apps, they basically produce a design, right? And there are actually a bunch of tools that help you create a design with prompts doing it. The design tools, they have the handoff to create something that is a working prototype. So the coding and implementation part is there. So they use that. You go on to, of course, sort of the application building once you have a system, but then test creation you can do with that. Documentation generation you can do with that. I think the further you go down this route, the harder it is for Gen AI to be adopted today, because basically more responsible generation is required. And so, for instance, in the DevOps space, you do see a decent amount of Gen AI, but people are less comfortable with generation and actual deployment. And so what in DevOps is you see it used for like root cause analysis, right? Where you're recommending a thing, but if you got it wrong, you might have wasted me time. But maybe like a little bit of infrastructure as code generation to an extent is just infrastructure as code. There are a whole bunch of attempts at an automated SRE that actually orchestrates and modifies and changes. But the level of trust you need to have in such a system is just way higher at the moment than anything that the systems can actually deliver. And so the way that the reality is today is that I think there's still a chasm between kind of this increasingly bigger and smarter generation and like enterprise level, or even like any professional development level reliability that you need. And the primary way that this is solved, and I say that with air quotes, is to basically rely on human review, which is increasingly a fallacy, right? As it makes many changes, whether you're reviewing the product in a vibe coding setting or you're reviewing the code in the IDE, you can only review so much. And we're here in security, so like clearly identifying the omission of something, like the lack of a security control. We could talk a little bit about Slopsquatting. I think it's actually a really interesting attack we should touch on. But those reviews are like massively limited. They're not fun. And but that's a way that it's being addressed today, basically by rolling over. It's like the self-driving car and saying, no, the driver is at the helm. They're supposed to grab the wheel when something goes wrong. And then the second way that it's being addressed is to just create things in a more narrow stack. So V0, for instance, is put in the same bucket as like a Lovable or a Bolt or even a Devin. But it's actually a little bit different because they're really building towards their own stack. So they're like a little bit more constrained in what they create. And you notice it if you, Ashish, to your question about no code.
Yeah.
No code was really about building blocks. And the problem was creativity was limited because you can only use these like lighter, like a limited sort of
the Lego pieces you
finite
have
world, right, of things that have been pre-created.
Yep.
While LLM is like unlimited creativity. But the more unlimited creativity is, the more the more likely something will go wrong. And so they try to niche.
I love the analogy of the building blocks versus, it's kind of like what people did with the SaaS application. People thought, hey, thick client is not good enough. I want a SaaS application, but the SaaS application comes with its own limitation. That's the same thing. It's just that you don't have all the bells and whistles and you can't customize everything you want to. You just get like to your point, a V0 of what you wanted. Maybe not the V1 of what you want to put out on the internet.
Yeah. And I love the name V0. Like I give Vercel a lot of credit. Like it's absolutely embodied it.
Yeah.
And they don't really aim for the same audience as like a Bolt or Vercel. Base 44, by the way, interestingly, has actually trying to give you a much more holistic. They actually have all sorts of other settings around turning your sort of SaaS app. Lovable is going in that direction as well. So there's some identities forming.
What is Slopsquat? You mentioned briefly. What is that?
Slopsquatting. Yeah. I know, Caleb, if you've heard of it.
Yeah, of course. It was a great advisory. Go ahead.
I guess kind of two precursor to that, right? One is AI slop is becoming the term for spamish, for wasteful hallucinations or damaging hallucinations of content that AI is creating. So hence the word slop. And then I think we're all familiar with typo squatting, in which developers install a library and maybe they misspell it, or especially when a lot of these have cutesy names like Snyk. You might call them with misspell them or something like that. And then attackers might create a malicious library that has a name that is like the original one, but so you'd have a typo and you would pull in a malicious library. Slopsquatting builds on the fact that LLMs make up library names. And it's amazing. We've seen this actually heavily at Tessl. You tell it, when someone on our team called it, Amy on our team said that it's the LLM's cry for help. It can't do something. And so it just invents a new reality. I wish this API existed. I wish this library existed. And it just makes it up. And so it actually makes it up a lot. In this study, I think it was Socket, right? Who published it. It was Slopsquatting is a term from before, but the study found that a fifth of the libraries were made up. That's more than what I've seen. I think it's a little bit less than that typically. but still many libraries are made up and highly predictable. If you use the same prompt and you run it sort of 10 times, it's likely you're going to encounter the same library names. And so now attackers can create those libraries. And then now put yourself in the developer's shoes. You've asked the LLM to create something, or an assistant. It created a piece of code. It has a library that sounds totally reasonable for it to exist. Are you expected at that point to say, oh, I know all the libraries in this domain, and I know that this library is not the actual name of a library that actually exists on it? Like, I don't know, do a blind test. You're going to get at best 1 in 20 developers spot that. And especially when we're doing things with like new APIs. And so I think a real risk, and actually a much more real risk than typo squatting. And there isn't really a solution for it, right? Like, reviews are just not a solution. You have to put constraints. You have to put some form of guardrails of like reduction of the degrees of freedom.
Or whitelisting.
Not many people seem very interested in constraining.
Yeah, I was saying the same thing as he's talking about. Whoa. In order to solve this problem, you have to have some sort of external boundaries or rule sets. So for example, you might say, here is a list of allowable libraries to be used in our code, and flag any of those things through another tool that is not AI, obviously, to identify that those libraries. So for example, many enterprises have dependency boxes, and you'll want to ensure that the dependencies at which you're using are matched with what's in your code. And as more and more of this coding goes AI black box style, those kinds of things become pretty important.
Yeah. And I think that's if we talk a little bit about like security concerns, like many of the ones that are most real, we've seen this in previous tech trends as well, are actually the same ones we've had before. They're just multiplied now.
Yeah,
and so
in a new way. Yeah,
and you should have had dependency checking before for vulnerabilities. You should have had gateways, because typo squatting was a thing, and also some libraries seemed kosher and they were kosher, but now they're like massively vulnerable, or they changed their license, or they're deemed malicious, and so you need to have some of these protections. Same for vulnerabilities in code. And so like fundamentally, the solution is the same solution you should have had in place, but now you really have to have it in place, which is automated security analysis that puts guardrails outside. And I think the new thing is really that you need to be able to now also put guardrails on what's inside, the business logic, the functionality, I think in a bigger way, right? Like put some, which again, reduce the degrees of freedom, right? Maybe the stacks used, maybe the functionality provided, TDD.
Which I'd love to inject a G.I. Joe ad here around. This is something to always remember, that by and large, most security vulnerabilities are exactly the same since inception. It's just now done and represents itself in a different tech stack and is more magnified due to scale. But the same patterns are the exact same problems over and over again. You can predict these things like the clock. So, the more you know should help you here.
Yeah. And sadly, like I think also the other pattern in history is that people do not
care.
I think the thing that worries me most is not like hallucinations and doing it. I think if you accept that the code that the LLMs create is not going to be perfect, which I think you have to accept, then really it's all about things that are around. And I guess I think I just had another sort of a fireside chat there entitled "The Age of Risky Software." And I think with cloud, we had this sort of amazing embrace of the cloud because it was so easy. And in the process of that, like it had no scrutiny. People like which resources did people create and what did they configure and what happened to it 2 months later, let alone 2 years later. And we basically found ourselves in a jam, right? And the CSPM world really only showed up quite a few years after. And even then took a few more years until it got really cracked by Wiz to make it easy enough. And it was like today, I think it's probably still the biggest sort of single cause for breaches is probably misconfigurations in the cloud. And it's hard to remember, like infrastructure used to be a fairly secure thing. Like we had patching, like servers needed to be
we had
patched.
figured out
That's
firewall,
also true. Again,
but then we decided to open it to the internet.
Yeah, and it was also because it's easy. So like when we make things easy to create, then everybody creates them and we're all very happy. And then they create them irresponsibly with no controls. And then we're all very sad because they're doing it. And I think like it's amazing that everybody's a software creator now. It's amazing that you can create code so much faster.
Yeah.
But my sense is that in a short period of time, right, in a couple of years' time, we're going to find ourselves not knowing what code was even written and where were these vibe coded apps even deployed to, and what happened to this thing that was great 2 months ago, but then I forgot about it, and a year later it's a liability, and vulnerabilities in their code. And over time, because right now it's mostly code because they get deployed onto like specific stacks, but over time their infrastructure configurations and others are going to become the thing that everybody gets hacked on in the not too distant future.
Because we called it cloud sprawl, and now it's app sprawl.
Yeah.
Because there was like with cloud, there's this sort of healthy, almost sort of friction that was created, and you had to stand up a server, you got to plug the thing in, you got to put in resources. And when you made it as easy as clicking a button, then clearly that is going to go crazy. And we have done the same with apps now, right? There was a clear area of friction where you had to be an engineer, you had to have a lot of knowledge to be able to go build something, much less now deploy. And now you're getting to the point where you can build and deploy without knowing anything.
Yeah.
And enterprises are going to deal with this app sprawl. And especially, I think the pressure right now, what's nice is hopefully most enterprises have a good sort of segmentation between what is quote unquote production and the development pipelines that can be pushed to there. But you're going to create an internal problem where everyone can spawn their own little apps to go solve these problems. And running these apps, almost like actually Ashish and I were talking in our MCP episode about how, hey, are people now being able to run on their laptops sort of API servers that are being created through MCP on their little Claude code thing, and you can just go reach it and go and run things that they've built in their own little apps. So you're going to get this going back to almost the 90s when host machines ran their own services that you could go and use. Do we start seeing this sort of trend happening here?
Yeah. And I think to a large degree we are. And it's the beauty of creation. The world of possibilities opens up, but then it's a mess. And I don't know. I feel, by the way, just adds to that, just our sort of echo chamber of oh no, which I'm literally building a company to help people do more of this, more responsibly in Tessl.
Oh, I'm with you, Guy.
Yeah, it's not opposed to it, right? But it is about doing it right. But fundamentally, this is further augmented by the fact that data access is being given very prominently because everybody wants to do stuff with AI, and AI builds on data, and it is able to make use of it. Like before, you could write code, and if you could get access to much data, you still needed to go learn it. You need to doing it. So like another area of friction is understanding data, and that understanding of data has gone away because now you can just point the LLM into a source or multiple sources of data, and it just gets it well enough to provide real value very quickly. And so these are like extra vulnerable systems, but they're also like extra permissive or like with even more data access than we had before. If someone did breach that laptop, they probably have more to do with it than before.
Would you say then, in terms of where organizations are today, you kind of mentioned the 3 chapters in the beginning, from starting with, hey, we'll do coding assistant, then we'll have vibe coding to an extent, and then perhaps we get to the stage where now we have applications being created where you may or may not see the code. In terms of where you see in the people you're working with or the community you're building, where are people at different stages? Because I almost feel, is there like a pattern that's spread out for you? Hey, majority people seem to be chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 kind of a thing. Has there been like some sense of that at this point in time? Because we've almost covered 2 years of AI so far. We kept saying from the beginning that, hey, we can't trust the code. It does seem like we haven't reached a stage where we have stopped hallucinating. So where are people at the moment today in terms of those 3 chapters?
Yeah, I think so. Companies adopt alongside those lines. And so really within companies, predominantly, you are seeing this first category of coding assistants, and you're just seeing more and more usage of it. And so enterprises have gone from denial and trying to block it to shadow IT happening and then eventual acceptance to now leaning in and mandating it. So more and more companies are saying, you have to use this. Interestingly, by the way, very few of them are actually able to measure the impact. Like I've yet to talk to any leader who says, and now I feel like my development team is producing twice as fast. No, like they say, my developer teams love it. They all feel super productive on it. And some of them say, but I haven't actually seen that in the numbers. And they ask, can you help me figure out how to measure productivity over here? So there's still some questions, but this general sentiment is that it makes everybody notably more productive. Not 10 times more productive, but maybe 20, 30, 50% more productive. And it definitely is a thing that I think once a developer starts using with it, it's like in the internet, right? If you were developing like me, you're an old person, developed before the internet, and then the internet comes along, I cannot develop without the internet anymore. So it's like that. Like you'd have to pry at other hands.
I would also say I think people are still trying to figure out, get used to the sort of new workflow. And so I know when I started, it took a really long amount of time to start understanding and figuring out your workflow. And then there are also those swap outs, Guy, like you said, where I used to spend a lot of time researching the internet in order to find the cause of my error to fix it. Now that is gone. AI does that for me. But I've now swapped that time for more having to manage the AI appropriately and design my requirements better and do these things. So then my time sink has shifted into another area versus where it was, and just trying to like balance that really takes time.
So that learning process is happening right now, but I think enterprises are mandating that. With that actually comes some sort of policies around the security aspect of it. And what is, I see this with sort of the Snyk hat on it. You see a lot of people mandating a scan as part of it, like mandating the controls. There's some better tracking of the percentage code written by, I'm not entirely sure how useful that stat is, but they track it. It's definitely a relatively easy metric to track. And so they track that adoption, but they all embrace that. I think similarly, ancillary uses that are more focused are getting more and more adoption. Test generation is like very much top, especially for legacy systems. Legacy modernization is being helped with it because they use LLMs to be able to understand the code and import it for different versions. And so it's really like a helper, again, very review oriented, but there's still like substantial savings of time that happen there. And so everybody's a bit more in fill-out mode. I think the only real pattern of like heavily used and increasingly widely adopted is the coding assistants. And then you go into like agentic, everybody's in trial mode. Nobody's really using the kind of broad-based sort of Devin style usage of it. I think what is the vibe coding version is really much more in cursor, where basically just an individual developer can YOLO and just go. Mostly, I think what you're seeing inside companies is you're seeing apps built, like new apps built in domains in which you would not have bothered writing apps. And so you do see a lot of that, which is cool and a little bit concerning for security, and generally still very lacking. You talk to CISOs a fair bit, maybe more than me these days. And my sense is that I've yet to really see proper policies, let alone actual functioning controls around tracking these vibe coding apps. So they're a little bit more like either blocking or maybe choosing a platform that is just, you're allowed to use this type of platform here. I think that's all still evolving. And then acknowledgement of the problem, at least, like some of the conversations are happening. There are more like prompt firewalls and things like that, are more runtime AI security tools, which are a little bit outside of this conversation.
I think there's definitely some debate to be had. I think you and I had this debate, Guy, already maybe a year ago around who cares if it's AI generated code or not. At the end of the day, you as an engineering team or as an engineer are taking accountability for whatever code you commit. And the tools and processes at which you have in place for existing code today are the exact same tools and processes that scan any AI generated code. And so at the end of the day, this sort of worry about more code being generated could produce more vulnerabilities per se, in the fact that it does increase attack surface. But at the end of the day, you are still scanning the code exactly the same as if you were a human generating it.
Yeah. I think maybe if you don't mind me doing a Tessl plug here a little bit here, which is, I think up until now, we talked about current reality. And I think there's so much FOMO, so much like you have to embrace this today. Like literally big banks that I talk about how all the way up to the board, they have to report AI adoption. And it is 100% mandated. Big companies, like massive companies, like the giants, the hyperscalers, Google and Microsoft, report percentage of code generated by AI, which, as you pointed out, Caleb, right now, like who cares? And so there's so much drive that there isn't really enough thinking about where does it lead us. A lot of the attention is more about where can I use it today versus where is it leading me tomorrow. And there's a lot of reliance on reviews, which in turn creates a certain obstacle to like how much broad it can be used. I guess our conviction, just doubling down, Caleb, on your point around code, is that we shouldn't care about the code at all. In fact, the code should be disposable, and that really software should move into a totally different world in which it is defined by a specification. And in that specification, you say, here are the requirements, here's what you need to build, and then here are some like means of verification that you sufficiently trust. It's your choice, right? It could be as simple as ask the LLM to evaluate, does it look like the checkout function is working? Or it can be something that's much more hard-coded, and that's your choice. But those are really now your controls. And then from there, once you've built that layer, the LLM can get to work, and the system can come along, and it can iterate, and it can run. The problem, I think, has moved. The bottleneck has moved from being the competency of the LLMs. The LLMs have gotten really good. The reasoning models review themselves. With agentic systems that are now, MCP is like full of problems, security and otherwise, but it also is opening up a world of like an ecosystem of tools for agents to use. And the power is there. I think wielding it right now, harnessing it, that's the sort of the challenge in front of us. And so it's just reform, and it's just like humans, right? If you go to a bunch of intelligent humans and you just say, hey, create me a spreadsheet app, you ask for it once, you ask another group of intelligent humans to create a spreadsheet app, they'll create a totally different app with some overlap, but substantial changes. And so we think it's going to going in that direction, the development to change, but it's hard. We're getting a lot of excitement on it, and we're getting some early adopters. The product is not in market yet, but there's no tool of this nature that has gotten adoption in volume right now, because everybody's much more focused on what can I do to embrace it into my current workflows today.
Yeah, and I'm going to give you some credit, because it was easily over a year ago we were talking, and the way you explained this to me was so phenomenally light bulbish. It was basically like, when the world goes to where code is no longer looked at, it becomes a black box generated by AI. There are two things that become the most important. It's the requirements that you write and the testing that you do. And this now becomes the new cycle, because you don't care about the code. It's just, is it writing what I want it to write and validating that it does? And then that cycle, it feeds on itself in that new world, right? Where if validation fails, then you rewrite your requirements. And then this becomes the new cycle. And it's really something you predicted such a long time ago. And my confidence and conviction in that, I think, continues to build. As you vibe code, as you do this, you start seeing that is what's happening, right? You are managing an engineer. The better you build your requirements and how you define what you expect, and the better you write your test, or the better your LLM writes your tests. But the more you define those tests and how they work, produces the better product. And I thought it was pretty fascinating. And then how, again, pitching a little bit to you, you were like, and in that world, you want your AI and the way you write your requirements, you're going to need help in order to do that. And what's great about requirements is they're easy to understand, and they can be standardized if you do the right things and tell it the right ways, which is very cool.
As you say that, I don't know if you guys saw ChatGPT made a direct integration with GitHub, I think a couple of days ago. So you can integrate basically a ChatGPT directly into your private and public repos. Internet kind of went into this divide of, hey, how would you let your $1 million software be plugged into ChatGPT and it's not going to learn from it, versus to what you guys said, hey, as long as the requirement is met, because ChatGPT has this memory capability, and if you define your business requirement for, hey, as we are an organization that is building the best software for, I don't know, booking flights, let's just say, and whatever is required to make this optimized and save on performance, make sure it's secure, like whatever the basic requirements, the top 3 would be. Where do you guys stand on that, I guess, at this point in time, where, considering what we have spoken about so far, all this while, that yes, we should not care about code. Ultimately, it's the requirement and the rigorous testing around it, whether it's automated, as long as it matches the requirement, we're good. And I'm with you guys in the future. But today, as it stands, when we do have an integration where we are saying that humans are going to still require to be that person in the middle to validate, yes, this is a good change, bad change. Should I only use it for new microservices or API that I'm creating, or should I plug in my legacy code in there? What's the feeling about for people who are still hesitant to open up that door? Because Guy, what you said, I think I was watching a report on this. It seems like the majority AI use cases are in that larger financial organizations, the big techs, the big enterprises. They're the ones being pushed by the board. A lot of audience is still hesitant as well. They completely go, no, block all LLM because we don't know how to protect this. Policies are harder because I have to do all these lunch and learn sessions to make sure that Ashish, the developer, doesn't use an LLM and hence creates a shadow LLM. But hey, it's a different story.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on making those people who are on that fence for, I don't know, it doesn't sound like a good idea yet. Are we at a confident state that this is going to get better and better? Or are we saying that chapter 1 that we're on, that's where we're going to be for the next 2-3 years? I guess where I'm coming from is how do they plan for this?
Delayed. I think a bunch of things to unpack there. One, I think people continue, we might have even touched on it in our previous conversation, people over-rotate about hey, they will train on my data. I think when they make commitments, the big guys, if you're connecting to some sort of like a tiny company somewhere, maybe you have trust issues, but I think the big guys, when they commit to not training on your data, they actually mean it. And so I think people over-rotate. It's not a zero risk, but I think it's way smaller than they think. I think, Caleb, you were making this point in kind of my last conversation with you. I do think we're past the point. So if I look at what has happened, like in the meantime, and I appreciate, Caleb, the kind words there, but like in this year, is I think we've gotten to a place in which the models can start delivering on it. And we've really seen a step change, especially since the reasoning models came into play in their ability to really generate really notable and impressive things and understand requirements and iterate. And I think the other thing I built an appreciation for is synthetic data. And the two are not unrelated. The world, and specifically the big AI labs, have built very good mechanisms today around creating code, reasoning about it, running it, getting execution flow back into the systems. They're spending so much money on GPUs that actually this is not even notable in their spend cycles on it. The embrace of coding assistance, while it doesn't share the data, it does share signals about completions that are and aren't adopted. So those have improved things. And all of the labs have demonstrated that IP does not remain a moat. It's like they all still, which behind the scenes probably implies distillation, which is this notion of using a model to teach, to extract data, to teach. DeepSeek was like maybe the most visible version of it, but they all do it, the research papers. And so I think the competency, the skills of the LLMs are on a trajectory, which I feel more and more kind of bullish about. And the question is really about how do we engage with it. One of those competencies is understanding your code base. As more and more code changes have been applied, again, that flywheel of seeing when it worked, when it didn't work, bigger context windows to be able to take in more data, just smarter and smarter models. Today, they're getting very good. And we've gone from no context, it's just a generic developer landing in your IDE, to like understanding your project. Today, a bunch of these tools really offer you fairly thorough understanding of your institutional knowledge. And they actually have a problem where they're still not amazing at the garbage in, garbage out of understanding what is good about your knowledge base and where your code base that should be replicated and what's not. But I think it is building. And so people should focus. Absolutely, if you've got your head in the sand, everybody's going to be using it.
I did a B-Sides keynote last year, if you recall. And in that, I predicted that we would have self-updating documentation, like wikis. And just last week, I saw a project called DeepWiki, which basically auto-updates a wiki and creates a wiki of your code repo. So it will take your entire code, understand it, create an entire wiki, and any changes that happen, it auto updates your documentation for it. And I was like, this is, and similar, I think you're going to see that's not just in code, but in enterprise, right? About your team. Remember wikis, you represent your team, changes in your team, org reporting structure, documentation. I think all of that is also going to be very similar going down this road of documentation, and representing change in documentation will just be automated, which is very cool.
Yeah, the only thing I would highlight there is that documentation is easier than code because nobody builds on it, nobody runs on it. Like there is dependence, people look at it and they try to understand, but the blast radius of a mistake is just that much smaller than a mistake in code. Especially when another thing that hasn't been cracked, I guess, in the world of code generation is reusability, and it's not by mistake. And so these things, just beyond making up libraries, they reuse libraries wherever they find them. By the way, they don't use them wisely. They use whatever is prevalent in their code base. Again, kind of garbage in, garbage out. So they're not really aware of vulnerabilities. But importantly, they don't break up their own code. If left alone, letting kind of these applications or these LLMs build more and more, right, more and more code, will get more and more duplication in our system, more and more inconsistency with different apps, logging differently, having different things that
you have to specify that you need to
Yeah,
refactor this into modular, reusable components. Yeah.
And even then, there isn't really like natural sharing models. There isn't really a way to think about how to publish these things. And it comes back to like, when do you even know? Like, what is the level of knowledge you're supposed to have to be able to know, to tell it to decompose into systems? As I know, in Tessl, decomposition is a natural part of the flow of it. You have to break it apart into pieces. And so I think there's a lot there, but the skill is there. I think attention should be put on how do we interact. There's like a new kind of guest in the party, right? It used to be you have a human making decisions, and then you had kind of code and software that was running. Now there's another party in here, which is the LLM, and you have to say how does the human talk to the AI, and how does the AI write the code, and like it's a triangle. And triangles are complicated, and we need to think about how do we, and that's before you do introduce what does it mean to organization. I want to add one thing that's, I think, an interesting learning from the previous Spec conversations. And I hope, Caleb, that I have learned something like in the year since I have it. Like, I'm happy to have been right maybe before, but hopefully I'm learning. And that is an appreciation of the workflow. And so if you take that analogy of the dev becomes a dev manager that kind of is managing a set of AI labor that is building it, then what does the dev manager do? Yeah, in part is you say, what is it that we're building and how am I going to verify it? The other thing they decide is what is my delivery process? And that is necessary when you think about enterprise adoption. Every software that comes out, I need to know that it's been vetted for security. I need it to be, all vulnerabilities have been fixed, or at least I've tried that, but it hasn't been omitted. It is auditable and traceable. It is deployed on its infrastructure, right? It has been broken apart into units, right? Or has made an attempt to reuse software as it could. And if you're managing a capable set of people under you, then you don't specify everything. You choose what is the degrees of freedom that you leave to the intelligence below you to fill in. And I think that's important. So I more and more think that an AI native developer really is in charge of two things, not one. One is the spec, and the second is the workflow.
I love the conversation. I think I was going to say we spoke about the future, but in terms of, I think we could have had a long conversation, but in terms of final thoughts, where we are headed towards. Final thoughts on what's your favorite coding assistant tool at the moment, Guy?
Yeah, Cursor is my go-to. I don't code much, but when I play with it, I do Cursor. I do vibe code with Lovable right now. It's fun for side things.
Oh, fair. And the second one, which basically, we spoke about the future of AI and AppSec. Is AppSec going to evolve, yes or no? With this?
I think AppSec is more important than ever, and I think it needs to truly double down on automation and like leverage AI and sort of Gen AI within the systems. I think actually that world has already moved to being AI powered as it stands. Yeah, I think no doubt. Coming back to that age of risky software, it's like asking before the cloud, is patch management going to improve, right? Or sort of infrastructure configuration detection. I think AppSec is more table stakes than it has ever been. Yeah. And I think that would be many times more true in 5 to 10 years.
What Caleb said earlier, that just the same problems in a different landscape.
Yeah, indeed.
At scale.
At scale.
I love the app troll term on it. I might steal that.
Awesome. I feel like we should have another conversation about this whole topic again. Where can people find you and find out about Tessl and everything that work that you're doing?
Check out Tessl.io for platform sign up to the waiting list. Hopefully not long before you can try the product. In the meantime, check out a lot of great insights about AI and development at ainativedev.io. We also have our own podcast. I get to talk to smart people like yourselves and sort of many dev and AI leaders on it. So check out ainativedev.io. Maybe one thing is that the AI native dev landscape is something we released recently. Just tries to help people keep on top of the many AI dev tools out there. I think developers, but also security people and kind of leaders would find it useful to just know what's out there and consider how they want to handle it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Thanks everyone for tuning in as well. And I'll see you next episode. Thanks, Guy, for doing this, man. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening and watching this episode of AI Cybersecurity Podcast. If you want to hear more episodes like these or watch them, you can definitely find them on our YouTube for AI Cybersecurity Podcast or also on our website, www.aicybersecuritypodcast.com. And if you are interested in cloud, which is also a sister podcast called Cloud Security Podcast, where on a weekly basis, we talk to cloud security practitioners, leaders who are trying to solve different kinds of cloud security challenges at scale across the 3 most popular cloud provider. You can find more information about Cloud Security Podcast on www.cloudsecuritypodcast.tv. Thank you again for supporting us. See you next time. Peace.